Check 1 2 2 2. Check 1 2. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Check 1 2 2 2. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Today we will be discussing Check 1 2. Check 1 2 2 2.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I can please invite you to take your seats, our program will begin shortly. If everyone can please make their way to a seat, our program will be starting in just 1 minute. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if everyone can take their seats, please. Shh. The program is about to begin. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to what's going to be a very informative session. My name is Al Cardenas. I'm honored to welcome you here today, and thank you for joining us. You know, this afternoon we look forward to a discussion on America's role in the world. Simple look at the headlines, whether it's North Korea's nuclear threats, the crisis in Syria, continuing unrest in Ukraine, brings into focus the need for America to maintain a strong role in the world. Now it's getting to the program itself. You know, it's not every day that you get me, the chairman of the American Conservative Union, and the chair of the Democratic National Committee in the same room. And I've got news for you. Yeah. Not only am I fond of the chairman personally, but we see eye to eye on a lot of important issues, and certainly the issues that are promoted by this organization. And if you follow the rules of engagement and civility as to what's really important for our country around the world, you will know why it's not only not difficult, but a pleasure for me to join this session with Chairman Wasserman Schultz. You know, the USGLC has assembled a distinguished group of leaders here in Florida, following that same concept. It's assembled this group here in Florida because they're both Democrats and Republicans who believe that America must be a global leader, not only because it's the right thing to do, because it's also the smart thing to do. We're pleased to stand with the USGLC and its efforts to advance strong and effective international programs. I know that our special guests today, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Ted Deutsch, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, and General James Mattis joined us in this pursuit. Today we're going to have the unique opportunity to hear from our distinguished guests on what we call smart power. They're going to give us some insight into how investing in development and diplomatic programs helps us build a strong economy, fight terrorism, support allies, and create stability around the world. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you in just a bit. Now, to introduce you a little bit more about the USGLC and its work around the country, please join me in welcoming the founding executive director and the guiding light of the USGLC, Liz Schrager. Liz?
Thank you, Al. Good afternoon, everybody. Al, you are an extraordinary friend and supporter, and one of the most powerful voices for in the whole issue about America's engagement in the world, and thank you, thank you. This is terrific for me to be back in Miami. I was telling some I was just in my hometown of Chicago where it was snowing on Friday, so I am really thrilled to be back here. It is tremendous to have an opportunity to hear from our panelists this afternoon, and welcome to all of you. Congressman Deutsch, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Secretary Gutierrez, and of course General Mattis. We are all looking forward to hearing your thoughtful comments today about our topic. I want to thank our partners. They are all listed in the back of your program, and without your leadership and help, we could not do what we have done in putting this incredible group together today. Most of all, I want to thank the people who really make the USGLC shine and look great in Florida, and that is our Florida Advisory Committee, led by our incredible state chairs, who I know couldn't be here, but they lend their credibility and their time and their voice. And I want to thank Jeb Bush and Donna Shalala and all of the members, about 150 of our State Advisory Committee. Thank you to all of them. Now, while you're enjoying lunch, I know there are a few of you that are new to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and let me take just a moment to tell you about who we are. Several years ago, I laughed when the Washington Post called us the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. And in Washington these days, unfortunately, Al and Debbie often do not sit at the same table. I wish more people did like this. But what we do is we bring together a unique voice, just like what's here today. We have over 400 businesses and NGOs that are members of our coalition. It ranges everything from CARE to Caterpillar to the Chamber of Commerce, organizations like APAC, companies like Walmart, to NGOs like Save the Children. We have a bipartisan advisory council led by General Colin Powell that includes every living former Secretary of State, from Henry Kissinger to Hillary Clinton. We are, and you will hear from one of the best, particularly proud of a military voice. We have over 150 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals who have lent their credibility and their voice to our cause, as well as 30,000 individuals who are veterans for smart power that have joined our cause. So what brings this strange voices together? And it is our common belief that America must stay engaged and be a global leader in the world. And not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, but also because it's the smart thing to do and in our interest. But we believe that if you're going to be a global leader, you need to have some tools to help advance our leadership. And one of the tools is a little small 1% of the federal budget. Some people call it the foreign assistance budget. In Washington lingo, it's called the international affairs budget. But what this budget does is it keeps us safe, it advances our economic interests, and it demonstrates our values. A lot of us have been watching, and with great concern, what's happening in Ukraine these days. And I am reminded of all of the discussion that used to take back in the old Cold War era. Should we use more hard power? Should we use more soft power? Now, what the USGLC believes is what we should be using is what I call smart power, the idea that you need to invest in development and diplomacy alongside defense. I think you, and I know you in Florida, understand this better than probably any state that I am lucky enough to travel in. You, after all, are the international city, or I should say region, of the United States. You understand when there are millions of refugees suffering in places like Syria, Sudan, or girls taken out of their schools so horrifically in Nigeria, that we need to do something. You understand that terrorism to infectious diseases have no borders, and you understand better than anyone that when 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the U.S., that our economic interest is completely tied with the rest of the world. Businesses, and I could mention hundreds of them, but I'll just mention Dematec in here, a family-run medical supply business in Miami Lakes, who got a loan from Ex-Im banks, part of that little 1%. In fact, I know the managing director is here today. And because of that loan, this company now exports to more than 100 countries. And I know these businesses can do good and can do well all at the same time, bringing businesses back here. Now, I think we'll get a lot of hands on this one. How many of you have traveled outside of the U.S. just in the last year? I figured. Now, keep your hand up if you've traveled to the developing world. Anybody been in Tanzania in the last year? Few of you. Well, I got to go last year. And this is one of the fabulous women I met. I showed up I thought I was in the middle of nowhere, in the rural part of Tanzania, and I walked up and was greeted by a group of women singing and dancing to greet us. And this woman named Veronica popped up, and she says to me, I want to be on the internet. So I looked at her, and I said, okay, and I do what all Westerners do. I grabbed my iPhone, and I turned it on, because she wanted to tell me a story. And what she wanted to tell me is how she could barely make ends meet. And she couldn't make ends meet until she, as she told me, met America. She met USAID. She met a program called Feed the Future, who taught her how to take seeds and plant them in the ground so she could get higher yields to her crop. When she got the seeds, she told me that on their little plot of land, her husband believed that those seeds would do nothing. So they divided up the land. His side of the land floundered. Her side of the land flourished. What she told me, this woman, Veronica, is today she owns a used truck. Today, all 11 of her grandchildren now go to school with the extra money that she makes. And today, she is teaching 15 women in her village about the same things that she learned from, as she told me, America. So the reason she wanted to be on... She wanted to be on the internet so that I would come back to you and I would say, thank you, America. So that is exactly why the USGLC is here, to have this conversation about what is America's role in this interconnected, interdependent world, even when there are difficult economic times ahead. I believe the stakes for America have never been higher for us to be engaged in the world. I know we are going to hear from incredible individuals this afternoon to help share their insights of this very question. So I thank you. I thank you not just for being here today, but I thank you even more important to being part of our journey to do what our mission is of this organization, to build a better, a safer, and I will add a more prosperous world. To get our program started and introduce our fabulous guest speakers, let me introduce two of our important partners in this journey. Brian Siegel from the American Jewish Committee and Malvina Gasco from the Boeing Company. Thank you and enjoy the program. Brian and Malvina.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction and for your inspiring leadership of USGLC. I'm proud to stand here as the director of the American Jewish Committee alongside my fellow USGLC Florida Advisory Board member, Malvina Gasco from the Boeing Company. I want to start by recognizing the men and women here today who have sacrificed so much in defense of our nation and our most deeply held values. They deserve our appreciation and support for their service to our nation. I'd like to ask all the veterans in the room today to please stand so we can salute you. Thank you all for helping to make the work we do here in Florida and beyond possible. At AJC, we work to promote tolerance and mutual understanding and to advance human rights and democratic values in the United States and around the world. We do so with a clear understanding that we're fortunate to live in a country where these values exist and are protected. We also acknowledge that it is our responsibility, therefore, and in our interest to build a more peaceful and hopeful world. So in addition to our advocacy and diplomacy work, AJC has been engaged in humanitarian relief efforts for more than a century, partnering on relief missions in a number of global crises. And doing this work it is evident that America is indispensable, and our innovative spirit and humanitarian investments are working to address many of the world's problems. In fact, U.S. aid and development programs are fighting famine and hunger, providing relief efforts in response to disasters, combating diseases like HIV/AIDS and malaria, empowering women and girls, providing tools to create more just societies, and so much more. These efforts are all evidence of the life-changing impact of that small but mighty 1% of federal spending we all know as America's international affairs budget. Today, I'm proud to stand alongside my fellow USGLC Florida Advisory Committee member, Malvina Gasco. We've come together through USGLC because we know that America's global leadership benefits all of us.
Buenas tardes, Miami. My name is Malvina Gasco. I am State and Local Government Relations with the Boeing Company, and I get to live in the lovely state of Florida. Boeing is proud to be part of today's program as we also serve in the National Board for the USGLC. Here's an interesting fact about the Boeing Company. Over 80% of our revenue is spent right here in the United States, even though 80% of our product is exported to foreign markets. That is positive economic impact and good-paying American jobs. This underscores the importance of having the right policies and the right tools in place to be able to do business around the world. It is May, which means it's World Trade Month in Florida, and you don't have to look far to see the impact trade has in our community. Over 23% of jobs in the state of Florida are supported by trade. Last year, $60 billion worth of goods and services moved through the state of Florida to foreign markets. And over 95% of those exporters are small and medium-sized businesses. There is a direct link between the business that we do and the credit we must give to development and diplomacy programs funded by the international budget, as they are the foundation to doing that development and business overseas. But don't just take our word for it. We'll hear today from some local experts.
With our economy the way it is today,
some people are asking why we're spending so much money overseas
and not on creating jobs right here at home. Well, actually, we're not spending much money.
Just 1% of our national budget goes to the international affairs budget. That's not a lot.
And helping create American jobs is just what that money's doing.
If you want to create jobs, you have to create more demand for products and services.
You need more customers.
And where are American companies finding more customers?
Not here, but here.
And here.
And here.
95% of the world's customers live outside the U.S.
95%.
When we sell goods to them, they're called exports. U.S. exports accounted for a big part of our economic growth last year.
Half went to developing countries.
And their economies are growing 3 times faster than developed countries. And every 10% increase in exports equals a 7% increase in jobs here.
So, how do we increase exports?
Build new markets for American goods and services.
Remember that 1%?
America's international affairs budget helps fund programs
That improve health and education.
supports agriculture development,
Builds a stable economy.
And creates new markets. So if we don't go to the biggest, fastest growing group of consumers,
other countries will. Other countries already are.
Investing a small amount in global development and diplomacy
It's not only the right thing to do,
it's also the smart thing to do.
to make our economy stronger.
To create more jobs.
For my mom,
For my dad.
or my neighbor.
for me.
Kids really have the best ideas. It is now my honor to introduce General James Mattis, a man who requires little introduction, but whose list of accomplishments is far too impressive to go unrecognized. The general has held many important leadership positions throughout his career in the Marine Corps. You might even say he has a specialty in global leadership, having served in over 70 countries, culminating in his post as Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command when he used to call Florida home. He's also a member of the United States Global Leadership Coalition National Security Advisory Council, which now numbers over 150 retired 3- and 4-star general and flag officers. General, we're so honored to have you join us today. We thank you for your service, and we look forward to your insights. Give me one more second. I got to go to a couple more interests. After his remarks, the General will be joined by Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Ted Deutsch, and the Honorable Carlos Gutierrez for a discussion on American engagement and its impact on Florida. We are pleased to be joined today by 2 members of Congress who are outstanding advocates and champions for U.S. leadership in the world and who need very little introduction today. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, representing Florida's 23rd District, wears many hats. Serving as chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, Chief Deputy Democratic Whip in the House, and as a member of the House Appropriations Committee. On appropriations, she serves on the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which funds America's smart power, tools of diplomacy and development. That is everything from assistance to key allies such as Israel to the Peace Corps and trade and export development. Congresswoman, thank you for being such a strong supporter of these issues. Another wonderful supporter we have in the room today is Congressman Ted Deutsch, who was elected to Congress in 2010 and represents Florida's 21st District. He serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he is the top Democrat on the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee. Congressman Deutsch has a wealth of knowledge about the role that smart power plays for advancing America's national security and economic development. Congressman, we're delighted to have you here today. As Secretary of Commerce under President George W. Bush, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez worked with foreign governments and U.S. business leaders to advance economic relationships, enhance trade, and promote U.S. exports abroad. Secretary Gutierrez has a keen understanding of the intersection between U.S. global engagement and our nation's prosperity, spending nearly 30 years with Kellogg Company and rising to become CEO and chairman of the board. They will be joined by our distinguished moderator, world editor for the Miami Herald, John Yearwood. We are so honored to have all these distinguished experts with us, and we look forward to hearing their insights. But first, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a true leader and advocate for U.S. smart power, General James Mattis.
Thank you, Malvina. If we ever needed a more wonderful example of why we keep our borders open, this all-American lady who didn't even arrive in America until age 17 and speaks English much better than this Marine infantryman. And I would just tell you it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful corner of America. Like Malvina said, I did live in Florida over on the other side in Tampa for a few years recently. And I would just tell you that it's a pleasure to represent the military's perspective to all of you on America's role in this world. And it's a world, as we all know, that's awash in change. But Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Deutsch, Secretary Gutierrez, ladies and gentlemen, I would also tell you that it's a time of both opportunity and peril. And it's not a time to take refuge in our fears. It's a time to stay engaged. It's a time when technology has certainly made our lives easier. Look at how we live today compared to even a couple decades ago or certainly 100 years ago. But at the same time, technology's dark side has brought dangers we've not seen before in the history of the world. It gives a handful of maniacs, as we saw on 9/11, the opportunity to kill an awful lot of people, the level of killing that we would normally associate in history only with a nation state. I would tell you, too, that millions of people who have been lifted out of poverty feel opportunity, and yet at the same time, man-made problems suppress the hopes of both political and economic freedoms for far too many people in this world. We have information available today to every one of us sitting in this room that even a decade ago we could not have gotten anywhere near so easily and certainly was not so widely dispersed among the peoples of the world. And yet governing, no matter what country it is, what international organization it is much more difficult in this age of transparency and diversity. And if you look at my former region, one that Congressman Deutsch knows very well, the Middle East, it's very tumultuous right now. And it provides a glimpse of the challenges that we Americans must deal with and from which I believe we cannot hide. The potential for North American energy independence, which is probably coming very, very soon, probably within the next several years, I would tell you could understand any American saying, why don't we just recoil? Why don't we just pull back from this maddeningly complex Middle East? It just seems to be constant turmoil, constant danger. So let me very quickly highlight three anchors, American anchors, anchors in the American interest that keep us anchored in the Middle East. The first one is our American economic interest. And in that regard, specifically oil, which is a globally traded commodity, I would tell you that 40% of that commodity comes out of the Arabian Gulf region. We Americans may not directly consume any Arabian Gulf oil in the future, and yet at the same time in a globalized world, our economy, including here in Florida, is inextricably connected to countries that rely totally on Middle East oil. And should that supply, ladies and gentlemen, be jeopardized even for a short time, then from Massachusetts to Texas, from Florida to California, the world's largest economy, ours, the one that Malvina mentioned most of Boeing's products go to, would be immediately and severely impacted. And let's remember that the price of oil at the pump, price of gas at the pump worldwide will be set by Middle East costs. That's a simple reality when you have 40% of the oil coming out of that region. The United Arab Emirates Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed has made very clear that because the world's economy depends so much on Middle East oil, then it's an international responsibility to maintain stability in the Middle East. And we violate that idea at our peril. And I would point out, too, that America's role in maintaining that stability, its military role, is very clear. Our 5th U.S. Fleet that comes under U.S. Central Command has been orchestrating international mine-clearing exercises for the last 2.5 years. And in those exercises, ladies and gentlemen, over 24 countries have participated. In fact, that was the first year we had 29 countries. Last year, we had 35 countries participate. They include countries like Canada, Estonia, Japan, Singapore, Djibouti. We had every continent represented except Antarctica, and we were looking for a couple of penguins to bring in to represent them. But I would also point out it's only the U.S. Navy that has the military capability and the Americans who have the trust of that many nations in the world that could amass that sort of international strength and resolve. And it has had the result of toning down Iran's rhetoric, Tehran's rhetoric about putting mines in the water. You haven't heard much of that in the last 2 years. And the reason was they saw the U.S. Navy demonstrating an international coalition that the rhetoric was actually building against Tehran's message. And that bought time for economic sanctions, for diplomatic moves to try and address the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Not the Iranian nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear weapons program. So that's the first anchor, is economic. The second is diplomatic. And in that, I can put it in very blunt terms that we all understand. If you want friends in your time of need, you're going to have to be friends with others in their time of need. It's that simple. In Afghanistan today, for example, 50 nations in the largest wartime coalition in modern world history fight shoulder to shoulder. And they are there because we Americans are there. They would not be there were we not showing that sort of leadership. And I just point out that it includes non-traditional security partners from some people's perspective. United Arab Emirates is a country that we in the U.S. military call Little Sparta. They stand beside us, ladies and gentlemen, every time we get in a jam. Let me go back a few years. Desert Shield, Desert Storm, United Arab Emirates troops were with our troops. You move on from there to Somalia, they were with us in that difficult period. In the Balkans, Kosovo and Bosnia, UAE was there with us with their troops. In Libya, one telephone call when the decision was made by NATO to carry out the UN mandate against Gaddafi to go after him. One phone call, and they launched the most modern F-16s in the arsenal anywhere because of they're most recently built. And they launched them, flew them into European airfields, and loaded bombs and supported NATO in attacking Libya. And then when the French and British, for domestic political reasons, had to draw down on their strength in Afghanistan, and knowing the Americans would have to pick it up if no one else did, United Arab Emirates sent in more fighters and special forces to help us there and take the pressure off our hard-pressed U.S. military. I would also point out Jordan, a rather poor country, and yet they told me a year ago that they would be in Afghanistan until the last American soldier came home. You can't buy friends like that. You've got to be friends in their time of need. United Arab Emirates stands face to face with Iran across the water in the Arabian Gulf. Jordan right now has over 1 million refugees living under the worst possible conditions coming out of Syria's violence. We are going to have to stand by them if we want them the next time we need those countries beside us in a crisis. Those are the economic and diplomatic anchors. There's also a purely security anchor, and that is that we're going to need countries with us on the counterterrorism and the counter-Iran efforts. On 9/11, we saw very clearly what happens if we can't achieve advance warning and effective collaborative with other nations counter-terror efforts. No country alone can defeat or even derail these kind of terrorist attacks. You cannot do it alone in a globalized world. So the bottom line is that we are going to have to stay connected, and yet one of the primary concerns I ran into as Central Command Commander across the Middle East, and I ran into it everywhere, was this concern about Americans retreating from the world. And it was the major issue I dealt with. I think they knew our military was very good. They just didn't know if we had the political will of the American people to continue engaging. And only our adversaries can take heart from the idea that we would pull back. It's certainly not our friends who are not going to be very happy with that idea. In this brave new world, we're going to have to reassure our friends. We're going to have to temper our adversaries' designs. And with history as our guide, I think we do not need to hatch some kind of shameful outcomes driven largely by historical or geopolitical ignorance. Let us remember that sometimes we can see America most clearly through foreigners' eyes. Very, very common. And a French traveler wandered around America about 150 years ago, and he said, America will be a great country so long as it is a good country. But if America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. Now, all of us in this room, even those of us who moved here at age 17, Malvina, we live here freely in a great country. And I would just say that we have no right to surrender that legacy that was handed to us by previous generations of Americans. At this point in time, the greatest provocation to our enemies would be America's failure to wisely stand up to them alongside our friends when our vital interests are at stake. And to address today's threats, we're going to need a range of approaches, which is why the global leadership folks are pushing so hard right now along these lines. And this is not about more military options. Our military, ladies and gentlemen, is the best in the world. There is no doubt about it. And so long as we get our country back on a fiscally sustainable path, it will remain the best in the world. But it's a false choice to say that we must choose between either more wars on one hand or isolationism on the other. That is a false choice, and it should be rejected outright. America, we must remember, has the power of inspiration, and it also has the power of intimidation. And I think balancing all of our tools right now, economic development, diplomatic, military, information, we should remember we have a message that we need to get out. Certainly education, we have a covert capability in our secret services. But as we look at all of these and employing the right one at the right time wisely, it allows us, if we don't pull back, to actually influence this world and make certain we craft one that we're proud to turn over to our next generation. And we're going to have to hold firmly and tend to our allies. I'm on record saying that if we Americans don't fully fund our State Department, I told up in front of the hearings, Congressman and Congresswoman, I said, then please vote for more ammunition because we're going to need it when things go wrong. I would prefer to drop in ideas and America's inspiration than resort too often to America's intimidation, and I think we all understand the alternative. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for hearing me out.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, General. That was a really great speech, and I think it frames perfectly what we're going to be talking about here today. I thought that your comments were really powerful in terms of looking at why it's really important for us and indeed for the U.S. to be engaged in the world. So thank you for that. I'd like us to continue the conversation by looking at why it's important for faith-based organizations, the military, businesses, and our community organizations to be involved in that and certainly equally engaged in that fight. But before we start the conversation with this really distinguished panel, I want to invite everyone to take a minute as we go through to write in some questions that are on the cards that are on many of your tables, and we'll collect those and ask some of those questions during the course of our conversation. Also, for those who are following us on Twitter, feel free to tweet in your questions, and we'll try to get some of those questions asked as well. Let's start by looking at picking up on where the general left off in terms of jobs. And I want to bring in our two Congress members first, and we'll start, ladies first, Congresswoman, by talking about why it's important for people at the local level to be involved and engaged in this exercise in terms of getting the U.S. More involved in the world.
Well, it's critically important in a community, especially like South Florida, which is so cosmopolitan and so international. I mean, whenever I'm outside of South Florida, I only half-jokingly say that foreign affairs is a local issue in our districts, because we do have businesses that are light years ahead in terms of the international business that they do. If we turn inward, if we become more isolationist, if we stop investing, if we constrict trade, then we're only harming our own economy. I mean, this is really in our own self-interest to make sure that we continue to expand our reach globally and look beyond even our own hemisphere so that we can make sure that we can kick our economy locally into even higher gear.
Congressman?
It's so clearly in our best interest. First of all, John, thanks for doing this. In general, it's really an honor to be on the panel with you and my good friend, Congressman Wasserman Schultz, and Secretary who's an expert far beyond, I think, where we are in so many of these issues. I appreciate the opportunity. It's clearly in our interest because so much of what the general spoke about resonates in every part of the world. The work that we do by supporting foreign aid, the work that we do by making sure that American ideas and American know-how and American values come into play in every part of the world builds relationships, not just the kinds of relationships that help us get intelligence and that help to ensure that if military action is required, that we're going to have allies who are there with us, but they help build relationships that strengthen the views of the United States. They help provide stability in those countries, and that's beneficial to our own economy, because with that stability comes the ability for us, for our businesses, for those of us who want to be engaged, the businesses who want to be engaged in every part of the world, to have those markets available to them. It's so clearly in our interest to be involved, and I think today's meeting is a good opportunity to drive that point home.
Well, that's a good place to pick up with Secretary Gutierrez. And terms of trying to determine why America's global economic power, why is that so important here in Florida and elsewhere in terms of creating jobs?
Well, you know what's happening today, we all talk about globalization, and it's happening, and it's a trend, obviously. But what's happening right now is a process of regionalization. And obviously started by the European Union, but as we speak, China, Korea, and Japan are talking with the 10 countries in Southeast Asia to create a regional bloc of Asian countries. When they do that, it's called ASEAN Plus 3 or ASEAN Plus 6, depending on how many countries additional to Southeast Asia. So when that happens, that will be the largest trading area of the world, bigger than Europe. You know, even Russia is looking at Kazakhstan and Belarus for a customs union. We still have a lot to do in the Americas. We still don't have a unified commercial integration. We have too many organizations. We have Mercosur, we have ALBA, we have the Pacific Alliance, we have NAFTA. It's all great, but we need one specific regional vision. And there isn't a state or a city that will benefit more from that than Miami. That is the trend, and we should be on top of that. But right now, the Americas are falling short because we haven't done enough to stitch together our agreements. We haven't done enough to be a region that can compete with the rest of the world.
I want to turn now to General Mathis, and I know you have served and certainly also since your retirement traveled the world. You've served as well with Floridians. Why do you think it's so important for Americans to look at what's happening globally and want to get engaged, want the U.S. government to be engaged in what's happening globally?
Well, John, ladies and gentlemen, I would just suggest that if America pulls back, we are engaged now. We have been. Coming out of World War II, our veterans came home, and they looked around and said, that's a pretty crummy world. But they did something about it. United Nations, NATO, Bretton Woods, I can go on. You get the idea. They decided we're going to make a world where we don't have to murder each other to make a point, where trade can actually go on safely with stability, that there'd be an international commons out there on several levels that allowed for a world where stability and the dignity of individuals could be raised through economic freedoms. And today, if we decide to pull back as that international commons comes under attack as times change, just normal part of the maturation of the human race, what's going to happen is there's going to be a vacuum. And I would just say that in the region that I focused on since 1979, that vacuum will not be filled with something you're comfortable with. I've dealt with this enemy for a long time. You're not going to talk them out of their ideas about girls don't go to school. They didn't arrive at that point rationally. You won't rationally undo them. We've got to give this region a sense of progress through education, through trade, that gives men and women hope for the future and for their children. And if we pull back, that vacuum is not going to be filled right now in the current turmoil with something good. And that provides a sense of urgency that the American people engage in this discussion and that our representatives are given support when they say this is what we need to do for our interest and the broader interest. John.
Let's sort of focus now a little bit on how the U.S. can meet some of these global and complex challenges. I know, Congresswoman, you deal with issues all over the world and some of the committees you're involved with. As you look globally, what do you see, where do you see in terms of conflicts that are happening where you can actually see that the U.S. having that influence?
Probably the most obvious example that I can think of where I've spent a concentrated amount of time is with women and children. Because no matter what country you're talking about, where there is strife, where they are still developing, whether it's challenges in trying to ensure that more children, particularly girls, can go to school, or where women as adults are really having trouble being able to make sure that they can provide for their families. Our microloan programs through USAID. I've seen in Egypt and in Turkey and in Colombia when we went there, and let me commend Secretary Gutierrez. Really, I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude for helping to educate me as we went through the decision-making process on the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, and ultimately I voted yes, which is not what a lot of members of my party did, but it was critical for us to make sure that we could use the United States' influence and make sure that we had more interaction rather than less in order to help the people of Colombia be able to continue to make the progress that their new government was trying so hard to make. And much of that is through making sure that children have the nutrition that they need, making sure that women have the resources that they need. When women are employed and are able to be part of the keys to a successful economy, their children can go to school. When their children get an education, that means the country has more opportunities to join the developed world.
Congressman, whether when you look at what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Ukraine or even South Sudan, what areas of the world, as you look at the world from your seat in Congress, where you see the U.S. is having and should have even a greater impact?
Well, I think Syria is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today, and if you look at the role that we have played, General Mattis will acknowledge that we're battling not just military and trying to decide how to be engaged, whom to support. These are difficult questions, but the people that we don't want to succeed in Syria are not just engaged on the battlefield. They're also engaged trying to win over hearts and minds. And so when the United States provides $1.5 billion in aid, in humanitarian assistance, it's imperative that the world know it and that the people who are receiving the aid know it, which is an issue that we struggle with, is how to ensure that that happens. But the aid that's being provided in Syria is important. The kinds of projects that we're doing to deal with the Syrian crisis as it's spilled over throughout the region. In Jordan, when we're involved in providing assistance for water projects so that the refugees in Jordan, more than 1 million, can have access to clean water, when we provide assistance to Lebanon so that the refugees from Syria in Lebanon have access to schools, those are steps that we're taking. Not only, they're successes if we make sure that everyone understands that's what we're doing, but those are steps that we're taking not only because it's the right thing to do, but because there are very powerful arguments being waged by those whom we desperately do not want to achieve any greater power. The most radical elements who look to the United States as their prime enemy, we combat that by being on the ground and offering a positive face to the United States. I think that's the kind of effort that our assistance allows us to put forth. We do it all over the world.
Mr. Secretary, you look at what's happening around the world. You look at China, for example, which is being very aggressive, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa. And I'm wondering, what do you think that some of the things that the U.S. should do and can and should do to help some of our businesses, whether in Florida or other parts of the country, to be more competitive?
Well, right now, and I don't want this to sound like a partisan statement, because it's not, but right now, the big news in the U.S., in Latin America, in our region, is that we have the opportunity of being the biggest exporters of oil and gas in the world in about 5 years. What's happening today is the kind of thing that happens once in a generation, and you either take advantage of it or you don't. But there is so much opportunity for regional supply chains, for LNG terminals in other countries, for refineries. We have countries from Brazil, Colombia, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, who are poised to go on a very fast growth track because of these findings, these shale and gas and oil findings. However you feel about that environmentally, this is a huge opportunity. And to the extent that we can get that on the table, debate it, have the American people weigh in, but our partners are getting a little bit impatient. It takes us 5 years to approve a pipeline. I think we've built one liquefied natural gas terminal in 25 years. I really need to step up because, as was said, China is very aggressive. They're trying to get their hands on raw materials. They're trying to get their hands on commodities. We talk about Ukraine. I mean, look, if you were to say to the Russians, we are going to start exporting natural gas, and we're going to start building terminals, and we're going to allow exports, because right now we don't, I bet you we'd get their attention, because right now their economy is based on natural gas. So it's very specific, but that is a once-in-a-generation opportunity that we have, not just the U.S., but for our neighborhood, our region, to really grow and prosper.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General, I want to come to you because last year you said something interesting, and if I may quote it, when you appeared before a group of U.S. senators and you said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. What were you talking about?
Well, you got to be careful saying things like that. That's one thing.
You get quoted.
But to tell you the truth, Liz, who's looking innocent there, set me up for that. Unbeknownst to me, she was in a back room talking to a senator. But here's the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen. If we don't lead with education programs, if we don't lead with commerce that makes other countries feel like they actually have some positive economic growth, then the conditions in which this enemy we're up against starts growing as hate-filled ideology, those conditions get better for their message. We're in a global argument right now. Do the values that grew out of the Enlightenment, the values that you and I read about in our Constitution and our Declaration, do those values survive or don't they? And simply telling somebody you're on the wrong side of history is not good enough. History is written by good men and bad men, good women, bad women. And I would just tell you that we're going to have to engage in this argument, and the only two parts of our government right now that I think are effectively organized to compete are the CIA and the military. So guess where we turn to too often at times, because they're organized to compete. We need foreign aid, we need our education, we need our economic policy, all engaged in a competitive way and recognized in this argument, sometimes a violent argument, that we are going to either win or lose. We're either going to turn over as good or better a world as we got to our children, or we're going to find ourselves in a position where we don't like reading the history books, because they will be written, and just by telling somebody you're on the wrong side of history will not determine the outcome. So where I come from is we need to organize all aspects of American power, and remember, again, we have the power of inspiration, we have the power of intimidation. Okay, when we have to, we can fight like the Dickens. But let's try to limit the number of times we have to fight by following some of these other competitive urges that if we just organize right, we've got good people in state, we have good people in commerce. They're all good people. When you have bad processes win 9 out of 10.
I must say that's a great line. America has the power of inspiration and intimidation. But I know the Congressman wanted to get in on this. Congressman?
I just wanted to add on to what the General was saying, because if you think about it, politics and policy are the art of the possible. And the reality is that we have to be pragmatic about this as well, in a bipartisan way. Just look at Syria and the red line that President Obama drew well over a year ago, when if we learned that they used chemical weapons, that Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, then that would be a red line that we would consider and we would act. The President called for a military strike. He asked Congress to authorize that military strike. That resulted in a debate in the country in which members of Congress heard from our constituents. Just to give you a sense, and I know that this happened having talked to colleagues on both sides of the aisle all across the country, but just to give you a sense of the pushback on military action that came from our constituents after the longest war we've ever been through in our country's history. I got 1,000 calls in my office during that period of time in a couple of weeks. 997. These are from actual constituents, not folks who call in from around the country. I get a few of those too, Al, as you might imagine. 997 were opposed to military action, did not want me to vote for a military strike. I was in favor of a military strike, and 3 were in favor. So the reality is that there is not an appetite for intimidation right now. That is not an arrow in our quiver at the moment, not if we expect political will. So it's imperative that we make sure that we double down on the diplomacy and the development.
Listen, I'm not quite sure how much of an appetite there is for anything right now, because there was a poll
We serve in Congress, we know.
There was a poll by the Wall Street Journal earlier this year that said a full half of Americans do not want the U.S. to be engaged globally, as active, certainly not as active globally. Which brings up the question I'm wondering, and we'll go to Congressman Deutsch and we'll come back to Congressman. What are some of the projects that you have worked on, that you've seen internationally, that can actually show that what we're doing globally is actually very important work?
Well, there are lots of examples. You can look in our own hemisphere for a number of them. And if you look at the dollars that come through the foreign affairs budget that fund drug interdiction programs here in our hemisphere, and the training that we provide all throughout the hemisphere to help countries combat drug trafficking and drug crime. There are very positive results, not just for those countries, but for our own as well. If you look at, if you look at also in our own hemisphere, if you look at our history of support for the nation of Colombia, well, the fact that Colombia is now our second, it's our second largest trading partner with Florida, I think fair to say there was a time where that would have been hard to imagine. But because of the sustained relationship and support from the United States in helping Colombia to become a vibrant democracy, that's I think another positive example. And closer to home in Haiti, spending U.S. dollars to help stop the spread of disease and to help build housing in Haiti, that's something that people understand is something that we ought to be doing. One, because it helps a nation close to our shores, but also because it's consistent with our own values and our sense of what we ought to be doing. When you look beyond that to Africa and the steps that we've taken to combat the spread of malaria and the spread of HIV and AIDS, these are really positive developments. The last thing I'll say is this. When it comes to economics, all around the world, we're not just dealing with these countries in a vacuum. There are competitors of ours who desperately would like to be more engaged. And if you look at the way that China approaches a lot of these issues, they understand that they're not just trying to make military sales, but when they go into Africa or Asia or other parts of the world, they go in with a desire to get a foot through the door by making investments in infrastructure, by helping the local governments and the local leadership. By playing a vital role in assisting these countries, we push back and we provide a reminder of how important the United States is as an ally and how important the United States is as a trusted friend. That will only help us in the event, as the General said, that military action is ever warranted and we need allies, but more importantly, that will help us on a daily basis as they look to decide where they should cast their lot as their own countries continue to develop.
Let me just say to the audience that we're getting some really great questions coming in, and I'll get to your questions right after this round. But if you have more questions, please write them down and hold them up, and someone will come and get them. Congresswoman, what are some of the examples? I don't think the congressman left you many choices after that.
I'm going to go in a different direction.
What are some of the examples that you've seen?
Well, I think Ted did a very good overview of some of the really clear examples. I think an example that perhaps isn't as obvious is our need to continue to be able to import and keep other nations' citizens to the United States, make sure that the borders remain open and we can bring the most promising minds from around the world to be educated in our country, and then have comprehensive immigration reform become law so that we can develop a pathway to citizenship for the millions of undocumented immigrants that are here and who are a part of the backbone of our economy and who add to the rich diversity and the tapestry of our country, and make sure that the idiotic, ridiculous policy of essentially requiring those students who we've educated to go back to their countries of origin to then compete against our businesses, that is something, particularly in South Florida, that is absolutely vital. I've talked to countless CEOs and business leaders who have said to me, and I'm sure Ted has as well, I have a promising young employee or a promising young student who's interned for me, and they're educated here, but their student visa is going to require that they go back, and I won't be able to hire them even though I have a job. Or we have companies all across this country that have job openings they can't fill because we don't have enough American-trained students with the expertise that we need. So we need to be able to, as we build those programs and strengthen our education system in those programs, particularly in the STEM fields, that we can import new Americans to be able to make sure that we can strengthen our economy.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
What do you see as the risk for the United States in a less active foreign policy?
Well, you know, part of the problem is that we never look back at our own history and learn from it. But if we take, and nobody wants to see another war, you know, we agree with the American people that we're all a bit tired of war. But that doesn't mean that the way of achieving that is by drastically reducing defense spending. We have a history of thinking that the last war is really the last war. And so after World War II, we cut our defense spending. We weren't ready for Korea. And we didn't ask for Korea, but that all of a sudden just came to us. I mean, we weren't ready for the War of 1812. We just, after the last war, we always cut back. And anytime we get near 3% of GDP, watch out. Well, we are near 3% of GDP now. Why? Because we're never going to go to war again. We've agreed that. And we just keep learning and learning the lesson. We learned a very painful lesson commercially with the advent of Smoot-Hawley, where we put in tariffs for imports, and our exporting partners said, okay, fine. You put in tariffs for imports, we'll put in tariffs for your exports. And we went into a terrible, terrible depression. We need to learn from that. And what you eventually conclude from our history is we have to stay stable, not jerk it around. This pendulum swing that it's either isolation or it's either war is what gets us in trouble. You know, keep it steady. Keep defense spending steady. Keep diplomatic investment steady. It's when we pull back and, you know, this push and pull that just confuses our partners, confuses our allies, and clarifies a lot of things for our enemies.
Well, General, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Feel free.
But in answer, in one of the questions from the audience, which actually gets to this very same point, why are we seeing increased voices of isolationists in both parties, and how do we counter that?
Well, I would go back to what the Secretary just said. We are not students of history in America. We're a young country. Many of the people in public office today, I think, have a very difficult time across the Western democracies. It's not just America, articulating what it is we stand for. It's almost as if they can't. I tell you the truth, ladies and gentlemen, I got Lance Corporals who are 19 years old who are more capable of explaining the nobility of what we've been fighting for than spokesmen and women in Washington, D.C. And, well, The idea that somehow we don't have to educate our American people along the lines of what the Secretary just said, and we don't have to take counsel from history is a very short-sighted approach to this. Will the U.S. military still fight if we're not ready? Yes. And not many people were alive in this room that can remember pictures on the front page of their newspapers, John, with American troops surrendering by the hundreds like that in the Philippines and Wake Island. We don't need to find something like that situation to bring us back together. Remember what you felt like on 9/11. Okay, go back to that. And the idea that somehow, I mean, I don't want to intimidate either, but I've also dealt long enough with the kind of people who will not resort to reason, who do not want, and there's a reason the Taliban uses bombs right now. They can't win at the ballot box. They know that. So as we support those who want to go with the ballot box, we have to make a compelling, persuasive argument to the American people. And one last thing I would say is, when I reported to my Marine basic training in the summer of 1969, a 20-year-old corporal handed me a rifle, combat veteran of Vietnam, and he said, "This is your rifle. This is your reason for being now." He said, "Don't ever point it at anyone unless you intend to use it." I would just suggest that before we give any red lines, we make certain we're willing to pull the trigger before we do it. And I'm not saying, and this is not criticism of any commander-in-chief. I was a naval officer for 40-odd years. I have no politics, and I haven't yet in my retired life developed any. But the point I would make is the commander-in-chief, when he puts America's prestige on the line, needs the backing of the American people. FDR held fireside chats every week, one night a week, over years in order to bring an American people sickened of World War I into an understanding that we were going to have to stand up with our Western allies if we wanted the values that we held dear to survive. I think it's an education issue and learning from history, as the Secretary said.
Now, since the questioner asked about politics, I wanted to, if I can get the two members of Congress to touch on that issue really quickly about isolationists. Why do you think there's that feeling out there that we should become increasingly isolationist? And we're seeing in both parties.
Well, I'm also going to attempt to avoid being partisan. The reality is that there is a very large group of members of Congress now on the right that is very focused inward, that has become extremely isolationist, both in terms of not being supportive of comprehensive immigration reform and specifically focused on closing our borders down and making sure that, that border security is our only focus. And also those same members being focused on not being supportive of an appropriate amount of defense spending. And those are the members that we have to battle to get the votes to put the foreign affairs budget on the floor and pass the bill with a majority of House members supporting it so we can send it to the president. Right now I think the Congress is both reflective of the way districts are drawn and constituencies who elect those members, but also it is particularly in the area of defense and isolationism. The Tea Party movement has resulted in some pretty extreme isolationist positions that have dominated the news the most recently.
Congressman?
I agree that we need to do a better job of remembering our history, but it's also true that there's always been an isolationist strain in our politics. And the example I'd give in just trying to highlight how you need to make this relevant for people. Before I went to Congress, I served in the state Senate, and we had a piece of legislation to try to divest from our pension fund dollars that were being invested in Iran to help the Iranians develop nuclear weapons. And I spoke to a number of my colleagues from other parts of the state who didn't really understand why we should care at all It was Tallahassee. There's not a lot of foreign policy made in Tallahassee. They didn't expect to have the debate when they went there. And they asked, why are we getting involved? And when I reminded them that it was their kids and the kids from their district who were being blown up with IEDs that were coming from Iran, the little light bulb went on. And it was an easy sell at that point. That little light bulb, I think, exists in everyone if you help them understand why making what are really small investments in our international affairs budget is so important to us and to our national security. And that's true in every corner of the world. Look, there are arguments that can be made that the members understand when there's a particular type of when there's a particular type of military hardware that's produced in their district. They understand how that impacts their district. They also come from districts, even those who don't represent wonderfully diverse areas like South Florida, who still have lots of groups in their district, church groups and civic groups who pay close attention to what happens around the world, who raise their voices when there's a crisis. We just have to help them understand why making a small investment now can avoid that crisis in the future. Then I think it's easier to get them on board. You can get them. A lot of people, when all of you go out and have these conversations with elected officials, you can help them understand why it's important when you share your own stories. We just need to make sure that the good work that this organization does all around the country helps to turn that light bulb on in the heads of members of Congress who otherwise might not think much about these issues.
Unfortunately, we don't have a tremendous amount of time left, but we've got some really good questions I'd like to ask. Next question to Mr. Secretary. China is a major foreign aid player in Africa, a continent with 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies. Are we being outcompeted?
Well, we definitely have a lot more competition today than we ever did. And yes, China is also, they're not only investing for raw materials and for access to commodities, but they're also investing in their soft power. They're investing in goodwill around the world, in Africa and Latin America, throughout the Middle East, and we need to step it up. So, 1% is a good target, but 1% could have been the right thing 20 years ago before China opened up and before the wall came down. And so we've got to be careful that what worked when we didn't have much competition, all of a sudden we have a lot of competition. And we're not the only ones out there competing with goodwill. I think most people would say, most countries say, we'd rather do business with the U.S. But in many cases, they'll say, where is the U.S.? We've got the Chinese here, and they're coming in, they're investing, they're giving us money. Where is the U.S.? Why aren't they here? And you hear that more and more around the world, and it's very alarming. Because as both of the congressmen mentioned, I agree. We're at a point now where we're tired of war, we think that maybe globalization has hurt U.S. jobs, wrongly, but that may be a national attitude. And that's what we're up against. We need to never let people forget that the U.S. is the essential country for an international engagement. And when the U.S. pulls back, it's bad for everybody. But right now, it's very easy to just say, let's stay away. Too many problems, let's stay away. And that is too simplistic and a bit too dangerous.
General, I want to ask you a question again from the audience, and this involves India. And I'm sure that you have, like many of us, been following the elections in India that just concluded. And the question wonders, what relationship do you expect with the new government there, and especially as you look at Afghanistan, India's role in Afghanistan post-2014?
Well, it's a very complex question, but I would say we have the opportunity for, I think, a continuing closer relationship with India, a huge democracy that just went peacefully to the polls and turned over their government. They, I believe, can be a force for stability. I think the reason they voted in the individual they did had a lot to do with economic development, how it stalled out there, and they need to get it going again.
and he's been very successful as a governor of his state in making that happen. And as such, anything that grows India's economy in that part of the world can be a stabilizing influence across South Asia. And it also provides a countervailing perspective of how you can advance your country without using the Chinese model, to put it bluntly. As far as Afghanistan, I think the most important thing is that we continue to try to quietly facilitate Indian, Pakistani rapprochement and lessening of tensions between those two countries. Otherwise, what India is doing inside Afghanistan could be seen as a threat by Pakistan, with the result, you know how people act when they feel threatened. So I think it's pretty complex, but I'd be very optimistic right now that we have an opportunity here full of goodness in the future if we work it right.
I'm curious, are either members of Congress, member of the India caucus? But I'm just curious, what your thinking is on, because we've just had this election, if you can give us some perspective.
Well, sure. I agree that there's an enormous opportunity, the relationship, to grow the relationship and make it deeper. I mean, India, we share in common as the oldest democracy, and India being the largest democracy in the world. If you look at what just happened in the election and the massive turnout, there is a sense that with the challenges that we faced, and we spent a lot of time in the Foreign Affairs Committee debating Pakistan and the challenges that Pakistan provides to us, and every time aid to Pakistan is brought up, there is I think a healthy and a very heated exchange. India offers us an opportunity for a strengthened relationship that may actually help us work toward a greater rapprochement between those two countries, which is in our best interest in the security of the region, especially.
Congressman, can we get a short...
Yeah, just briefly, I think one of the critical keys to being able to make sure we can help in India is through the continued assistance and aid that we provide to improve the lives of women and children. There is massive poverty in India, and education and bringing women and children up is going to really help strengthen that.
Now, we've just about at the end of our program, but I wanted to ask if you can take 30 seconds, each of the panelists, to talk about why this is so important to you. Why do you personally care about America's engagement in the world? If you can do that in about 30 seconds, we'll all be grateful. General, we'll start.
Ladies and gentlemen, you travel the world for 40 years as a naval officer. You see very good people living without hope. You know what we can give, not just in terms of dollars, in terms of example, education, opportunity. I just think that there's got to be a better way to solve things on this planet after 5,000 years running around here and shooting each other. And I'm pretty committed as a result to the non-military aspects of how we deal with our fellow man and woman on this planet.
I very proudly serve as the first Jewish woman to represent Florida in Congress, and really look through the lens of my faith, our commitment to what's known as Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and the values that my faith has taught me, that it is our responsibility to make sure that we can help strengthen and make other people's lives better, particularly when we are fortunate. And I think there is no better example than the strength and success of the United States, really using that value of Tikkun Olam to making sure that we can bring the rest of the world up to a standard of living to which we all expect and ascribe to live.
Well, just to agree with what was just said, it's not just commercial and economic, but it is trying to get values out to other people around the world. And when our values aren't the ones being discussed, someone else's values are being discussed. So I think one of our best ambassadors in the world is the U.S. multinational corporation. They go to a country, they teach meritocracy, they train people, they give them a career. Just a lot of values that are instilled in people just by working for a U.S. company. That has a tremendous spillover effect. People go home and talk about that company. They talk about that company in comparison to other companies. And that's the way U.S. values get instilled in a country. And the more people can look to us for a role model instead of looking elsewhere, that's good for the world and it's good for the U.S. And what the risk that we run by stepping back is that the leadership vacuum will always be taken. And the question we have to ask ourselves is who is going to take our place if we withdraw? And I don't think that we're going to like the answer. So, the world needs a strong and visible and engaged U.S., and the U.S. also needs that. So I can't thank you enough, this organization, for what you stand for and for your cause.
I want to thank Liz and the group for bringing us together. My father served in the Battle of the Bulge, and I never really thought. I thought a lot about what he did, but I never really felt like I understood it until I was standing in the taxi line at National. I think it was still National Airport on 9/11. Might have been Reagan. Standing in the taxi line on 9/11 when the plane hit the Pentagon, and I have spent all of my time in public life trying to uphold those values that were so under attack when my father and all the brave men and women here who have served our country have gone to battle for. And I now, which I felt under attack that day on 9/11, watching the smoke billow out of the Pentagon, I go to work every day, and I think all of us have an obligation in whatever way we can to remind our neighbors first and ultimately the world why those values matter so much and that we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about them, and whether that is the need to strengthen democracies around the world, the opportunity for economic growth that lifts up all people around the world, and pushing back against those who want to see our values diminished. That's the role that I try to play, but I think it's a role that all of us share in. It's an important one. And I thank this great organization, and Liz, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share with you these thoughts today. We can all do this, but all of us need to work together to remind the world what's at stake when American values are diminished. And I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming here today. My name is Carl Beckstein. I'm the USGLC's Florida Outreach Manager. And first off, it's great to see so many familiar friends here today, as well as so many new faces. We look forward to working with you over the next few months and years. First off, I would just like to thank our speakers today, General Mattis, Secretary Gutierrez, Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz, Congressman Deutsch, John Yearwood, as well as Al Cardenas, Brian Siegel, and Malvina Gasco. I'd also like to take a moment to really thank our sponsors and partners at today's event. Enterprise Florida, the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, the American Jewish Committee, CARE, and the Miami Council for International Visitors. As our Executive Director, Liz Schreier, always says, there's a difference between a good meeting and a great meeting. A good meeting is what happens during the meeting. A great meeting is what happens after the meeting. So I call on all of us here to make this meeting a great meeting. Today, we can come together and support development and diplomacy all around the world. We're not asking for your money or even a lot of your time, but we're asking for your support and your partnership to help continue this discussion throughout the community. For us, there are a few things we wanted to do to see if we can get all of you more involved. The first is I'll be sending all of you an email later this week with some of the highlights from today's event and the important discussion that we had here today. We encourage you to share that with your friends, colleagues, and coworkers, and the important discussion that we had today, and we hope to continue throughout our time here in Florida. Also, to all the veterans in the room, we'd like to encourage you to join our Veterans for Smart Power Coalition, which includes over 30,000 veterans from all across this country in support of smart power. Finally, we'd like to invite all of you to join us at our upcoming conference on June 17th and 18th in Washington, D.C., where we'll have a great opportunity to network and meet foreign policy leaders, business leaders, military, and humanitarian leaders from all across our country, all in one great place and 2 great days in Washington. And finally, we're very happy that you could join us today. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.